with my headphones or my microphone. It keeps on going on and off. Is it on now?
It's
It's
on.
working now.
It's your mic. I think your earphones are fine. It's your mic.
Yeah. What's wrong with my? There you go. Okay, we're live on YouTube and gonna be broadcasting live. Now you can play it, Dr. Eddie.
Hashtag Bangon Pilipinas. Blackwater would like to support our heroes of the front line who are risking their health and well-being to attend to COVID-19 patients. We aim to provide the frontliners of the Pasig City General Hospital hygiene kits which they can use daily. Blackwater, smell good, feel good. This webinar series is brought to you by Hoop Coaches International in cooperation with Blackwater. Smell good, feel good. This coaching webinar series would like to give special thanks to the following. Samahang Basketball ng Pilipinas Coaches Commission Head, Coach Jong Yochiko. Basketball Coaches of the Philippines President, Coach Louis Gonzalez. God Skills Head, Coach Alan Ricardo. And frontliner, Christopher Top Huyano.
Again, that's it. Good evening again to our dear coaches, our attendees, and welcome to our second session for tonight. Again, joining us is our resident sports psychologist, Doc Teddy Villasor. Good evening again, Doc Teddy.
Good evening, Coach Royale. Good evening, Coach Brian. Good evening, Bob.
Yes, and yeah, we have a special guest all the way from Cebu, one of our admin with our Hoop Coaches International page, and it's been helping me a lot with my scouting reports. Even when I was coaching in Malaysia, I will feed me scouting reports, and when I was coaching in Phoenix, and he runs his own blog, and he's a student of the game. He's Coach Bong Paredes or Emerito Paredes, all the way from Cebu. Coach Bong Paredes, I'll give you the honors of presenting our special guest for tonight.
All right. Thank you, Coach Ariel. Thank you, Doc Teddy, and good evening, everyone. I think some of you guys might have known me from the auction the last couple of times because I am the one who got Coach Jeffrey Carriazo's shoes and Kevin Alasa's Jordan shoes. I think it was a Jordan 5, if I'm not mistaken. So anyways, good evening, everyone. And I'm glad to be doing something different than just being a participant, which is a good thing, of course. And tonight's webinar's topic is something that coaches, we don't really discuss enough. I know it's at the back of my mind at least, and coach's mind, but it's something that's extremely important in any game, let alone the game of basketball. And that's long-term athlete development, or LTAD. And tonight's speaker is definitely an expert on the matter. He's a well-traveled coach with head coaching experience, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. He's also an author of over 20 books in the game of basketball. Ladies and gentlemen, Coach Brian McCormick. Welcome, Coach.
And thank you. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation, to speak with you guys. I guess I'm not really good with Zoom, but if anybody has questions as I go along, if you just want to jump in, and I don't know if it's easier for you to direct it to me or whatever, but by all means, throw out questions. I don't have like a presentation to show. So I'm going to kind of go through some old notes, on the long-term athlete development. So if, anything doesn't make sense because, I'm just speaking instead of, putting words up for you guys to read, then slow me down and let me clarify whatever I may have said. 15 years ago, I guess, I wrote a book on long-term athlete development called Crossover. The new model for athlete development or for basketball development, and based it on one of the original Isvan Bali papers. He is, or a lot of his work is what Basketball Canada has used to kind of create their long-term athlete development for a number of sports, and then, especially in basketball. And with recent success of a lot of Canadian players, Canadian junior national teams, NBA players from Canada, the long-term athlete development perspective has started to get a lot more attention. And so it's something that I've, used and followed, for the last 15 years or so. But it's also something that I'm cautious with. So I'm definitely not one who's beholden to a specific model. I kind of use the long-term athlete development from a general standpoint, not necessarily from a specific standpoint. And so I think a few of the major reasons to think of basketball and to think of your coaching from a long-term perspective instead of short-term perspective is a lot of issues, at least in the States. And, I'm very unfamiliar with basketball in the Philippines and wherever else people are tuning in from. So these may or may not be issues there. I'm speaking primarily from the United States and from our experience here. So how generalizable that is to other countries, is probably debatable. But, some of the big issues that we have in youth sports that hopefully can be remedied by taking a more long-term approach, are things like early specialization and early talent identification. So here in the States, you might have teams that as young as under 12s, or under 10s, they're already selecting players, making cuts and determining essentially who's good and who's not, at a really young age. And then once these selections are made, they're going to funnel these, children into, specialized sports participation where they only play basketball or they only compete in basketball. It's basketball 365 days out of the year. And so, through the, general frameworks that people use for long-term athlete development, one of the big things is, as young athletes, we want to encourage sampling as opposed to specialization. So, sampling would be playing, multiple sports at a young age. Specializing would be, only playing one sport. And then, one of the questions always becomes, well, my child only wants to play basketball. My child doesn't like other sports, And so, some people that are beholden to the model are like, well, no, they have to play other sports. It's better for them. I'm more of the mindset that, if a child, chooses, I only want to play basketball, I'm, who's to tell them they're wrong, and I think there's things, around basketball that you can do to try to incorporate some of the other skills that you might miss out on, by not playing other sports. But to me, it's better. And what I try to promote is, young children, say at least to the age of 12, if not to the age of 14, are sampling multiple sports, and whether that means that they're playing on multiple teams, in organized or competitive leagues, or whether that means that, they play basketball on a team, they play soccer, they play baseball, whatever, in their neighborhood or in their recess at school, things like that. To me, both have validity. It's not just a matter of, I'm playing basketball and that's the only thing I do sports wise, but, I'm starting to incorporate, even in informal play, I'm incorporating participation in other sports and learning lessons and developing skills from these different sports. Like I said, if you do have a child who only wants to play basketball, or maybe the way, leagues are structured, it's only possible to play on one club team. There are things that you can do in terms of your free time, and or, incorporating a little bit more athletic development into basketball practices, maybe start with, basic strength training, at a younger age, or more organized strength training at a younger age, to try to get some benefits. I know when I was one of the teams, that I coached in Europe, the youth players, most of them only played, one sport. They were in the basketball club. They weren't also on a, soccer club or a handball club. I think there was really only one player that I remembered who played on a basketball club and a handball club. But some of the other children, yeah.
I just two questions, just quick questions.
Sure.
What is the age range for the youth players and for early specialization or talent identification?
So for me, generally, what I'm talking about when I say children is say 8 to 13, 18 to 4, or 8 to 14, and then from 14 to 18 or 14 to 19, that would be teens for me or adolescents. So that's kind of my general break is somewhere around 12, 13, and younger is, what I would term youth or children. From 13, 14 and older to me would be teens or adolescents. And so when I say youth or children, I'll try to be specific, and that's what I'm referring to is the younger age group. And then, if I'm talking about, kind of older, when we're getting more towards specialization, then, I'll reference that as teens and adolescents, as long as, as much as I can think of that.
In terms of the skill identification, aside, is there an assessment base as well? Do you have tests to gauge their development in those areas?
Do I use tests?
Yeah.
I don't think that you can. Well, there are certain things that I think you can do that can probably test for potential, but it's not something that I would do. For me, I'm of the mindset that, from 14 and under, we shouldn't be cutting children at all. The goal should be, as Marco Sullivan, who's a child sport expert out of Stockholm, Sweden, he talks about as much as possible for as long as possible. And to me, that's the best developmental model. When I wrote Crossover, people thought that I wrote it in response to the U.S. losing at the, I guess it was the 2004 World Championships. And to me, that was of little importance to me. As I said at the time, my goal was that by creating a better environment for all players, will eventually lead to better development for the elite players. And so my focus was never to see if we can make better, see if we can make LeBron James marginally better by having a better development environment. It was more based around, can we create the best possible environment for the most possible children? And so to me, in the States, much of youth sports is based around the players who we identify as elite. And like I said, many times we're identifying 9, 10, 11-year-olds as elite. And to me, there's no such thing as an elite 9, 10, 11-year-old. They haven't reached, full adult stature. They have, they don't have adult skill levels. I don't even think they should be playing on an adult sized basket. So to call them elite, just because they can do, fancy dribbling drills on YouTube or something like that, I think it's a misnomer. So I'm of the mentality or the mindset that with young children, again, at least to the age of 12, but ideally to the age of 14, we're not going to cut players, and we're going to try to keep as many players involved as possible. Now, I know from a feasibility standpoint, that's not always possible. There's not enough room in gyms. There's not enough games. There's not enough playing time, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think that's a reason to reorganize the way that we run teams, or the way we run leagues. But that's another argument. Like for instance, I think at least to the age of 10, if not to the age of 12, players should be playing 3-on-3. If you're playing 3-on-3, there's a lot more room for children in the same gym as if you were playing 5-on-5 games. If you take a typical high school gym, in the States where you've got 10 players playing at a time, maybe 20 players, on the two teams, two teams of 10, they're basically getting a half worth of game time at that point. If you have play half court 3-on-3 games, now you can easily get 32 players involved. So you've, gone up by, a third in the number of players that you're getting actively involved and participating. And so to me, that is the way that we should be changing leagues or approaching youth development, as opposed to saying, well, we have this limited amount of gym space, so we're going to pick the 10 best 10-year-olds right now, and then we're going to cut everybody else. You're basically making decisions on who's going to have potential or who's going to be good at 10 years old when they haven't even reached, their full adult stature, if nothing else. And so to me, we want to encourage as many players to play as possible, keep as many players involved as possible for a multitude of reasons, not just because we might at 10 years old cut a player who eventually could be, an All-American or a NBA player, but also because cutting those players is going to lead to, various issues in terms of, obesity, health, motor skill confidence, all these things that by playing youth sports, children are more likely to continue being active and continue to play sports throughout their lives all the way into adulthood. And that's one of the things that the long-term athlete development talks about, is not just ending when you finish your playing career, whatever level you reach, but having that last step, which is transitioning into some other part of sports participation. So when you leave the game as a competitive athlete, is there a transition for you into coaching? Is there a transition for you into refereeing, into administration? To me, this is one thing that European clubs, especially at the level where I was, which was, the lower level kind of leagues, not Spain, not Italy, not the big professional clubs, but the, amateur run clubs, where the clubs are run by former players, and so, you go and you play until you're however old, 25, 26, 30 years old, and then you transition. Now you become a board member, now you're helping the next generation of players. You're setting up programs, you're finding coaches, et cetera, et cetera. And the clubs are all, run by the players and by the former players. And so everybody's involved, and then, it becomes a social club. It's their friends, it's their community, as opposed to in the States where everything's fragmented, and you go from one team to the next, and it's either dependent by, a school board decides the coach and how much money that you have, and, the athletic director decides what fundraising you're going to do. And it's all away from the players and the former players. And some schools end up doing it better. They bring back former players as coaches or administrators. Maybe they create a booster club, and things like that can try to replicate some of the advantages. But, and to me, European clubs do a really good job of being player run and player centered, because there's nobody else to do it. There's no full-time jobs being an athletic director runs a basketball club, or being a full-time basketball coach. Everybody has to work together, whereas in the States, you have full-time coaches, full-time administrators where their job is to do these things. And it's just a different environment. So I think one of the ideas with the long-term athlete development, again, is it's not just a matter of building to the end of your career, but what are you going to do? How can we keep you involved after your career ends? Like, again, I remember doing a clinic in Greece, probably around 2004, 2005, and walked into the gym to do a clinic, and there's a bunch of like 80-year-old guys out on the court, and they have their once a week game, with a bunch of former players who, are still healthy enough that they can get out on the court and play a little bit, and they're out there playing, and so that's the kind of part of the long-term athlete development program that tends to get ignored. We focus on, well, how are we going to build these elite athletes using this program, developing players over a series of years. But, part of the actual program is, or the plan is, what happens when they finish their careers? How can we transition them and keep them involved and keep them active, so that we have adults who are active throughout their entire lifetimes, as opposed to people who play competitively to a certain age. And then once they, finish that age, they stop physical activity, and so obviously then comes all kinds of health risk. So
Right.
keeping,
Coach Brian,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Part of the reason why I really wanted to make sure that you could speak to us here, because here in the Philippines, basketball is the #1 sport. And just like what you mentioned earlier with the teams in Europe that you had the opportunity to coach, rarely do we have elite basketball players. I'm not going to say rarely because I don't know the specific numbers, but we don't have a lot of players that play multiple sports at the elite level. So I think the only school here in the Philippines that does something similar of a long-term athlete development program would be one university, and they use it as a feeder program for the next stage of development, which I think is Ateneo. But other than that, I'm not sure if any schools or region are doing it the same way you are explaining it to do. And speaking about your book Crossover, when you said the end goal is to develop a global basketball player, which is the goal of every Filipino, because like what I said, we all love basketball here. How would you describe that type of basketball player? And bleeding into the stages of the 5 stages of long-term development that you have in your book, could you talk about how we get to that point at a high level explanation, the global basketball player that you're explaining in the book?
Sure. So for me, a global player is somebody who has all the skills, so I mean, now I guess we'd, refer to it as positionless basketball. So as opposed to, a more traditional approach was, a specialized position, so, I'm a point guard, I'm a center, so I'm on my under 12 team and I'm the center. Like I used to train a bunch of children, and I had a 12-year-old come to me, and I wanted to work on his shooting. He's like, my coach doesn't let me shoot. I'm in the center, I don't shoot. And so that's the opposite of a global player. Why are we telling a 12-year-old, not to shoot? Because that 12-year-old center, by the time he was 13, maybe 14, everybody had grown past him. At 12 years old, he was already taller than his dad. It was easy to see that this kid was not going to be a 6'5" high school player. He was, 5'6", 5'5", whatever it was, as a 12-year-old, and his dad was 5'6". He's not going to be tall. So why are we treating him as a post player just because he grew early, and now we're going to limit his skill set so that he has a very limited opportunity to advance to, even junior high or high school basketball. And so that's part of it is teaching all skills to all players, really from all ages, so, I mean, I really wouldn't say to use, positions or, specific position practice until you get to at least the competitive. So to go back to, what you mentioned. So in Crossover, I have 4 different categories of athletes. We have recreational, which a recreational athlete can go throughout one's career. So generally it's going to be players at the youngest age groups when they're starting out, and then also at the oldest age groups. So once you finish your competitive career, then you're going to transition back being a recreational player. Typically your recreational players are motivated by fun and exercise, not necessarily by, practicing or learning or improving, or winning games. You're mainly out there to enjoy the activity, to have fun, and to get some exercise. Developmental athletes, again, are throughout the age spectrum. They're motivated by learning and improvement. So competition is used more to measure progress, not necessarily to determine rank. So typically we're going to see children naturally progress from recreational to developmental. When they start to really embrace, well, I really like playing basketball. Now I want to get better at it. I want to learn this skill. I want to shoot better, and so they're making this transition themselves. This is something that's important to them and something that they want to learn and improve. And then through improving, they're going to continue their, confidence and build their confidence. Then the third kind of athlete is competitive athletes. And so this is when, winning starts to become important, typically middle to late adolescence, where, now, I'm training because I want to get better, because I want my team to win. I'm playing this competition, I want to win this competition, or I have I have to make a team, so I'm training so that I can make this team so that, I can further my career. And so the competitive athletes, again, there's not a fixed age range. Some are going to naturally progress to that kind of mentality earlier. So, maybe 12, 13 years old, they're really starting to focus on, trying to win. For many others, it's going to be more 14, 15. A lot of that is also going to be dependent on the coaching environment that player is in. So if a coach is more developmentally oriented and the parents are more developmentally oriented, then you're more likely to prolong the developmental period. If the coach is overly competitive and all they care about is winning, then you're going to end up with, players who gravitate towards that, and players who maybe aren't ready for that might drop out. So if I'm, coaching 12-year-olds and I'm overly competitive and all I care about is winning, and I'm telling that 12-year-old, who's 5'6", that he's a post player and he's only allowed to be under the basket and he's only allowed to shoot layups, he's not allowed to dribble the ball, he's not allowed to shoot jump shots. If that 12-year-old is really motivated by winning, that might work for him. He might still be interested. He might still be motivated to play, even though he's not developing his skills further. If that child isn't really competitively motivated yet and doesn't care as much about, winning yet, and whether his team, goes to the tournament or that tournament or what trophy to win, and instead is more like, no, I want to learn, I want to get better, I want to shoot jump shots. Well, that player is probably not going to succeed on that team. They may quit sports altogether. That's one of the reasons why we often see around the age of 13, there's a dramatic drop off in sports participation. And one of the reasons likely is that around that age, coaches tend to get a lot more competitive, and a lot of children really aren't ready for that jump in competition because they're still more focused on developing, and they have that mentality or the personality that they're trying to improve themselves still. Coach is coming in saying, no, improvement is one thing, but we really want to win this game. And so we have a mismatch between what the player wants and what the coach is doing. But some may embrace that, and those are the ones that are likely to succeed at that age. But it may not help them as they move on. Like I said, a 12-year-old who's already full grown and not learning, the global skill set is not going to have a long career as a basketball player. And so even though it might work for that player because he likes the competition and he wants to win, he's really competitive, he's likely not to have a long career, because he's not developing the skills that are going to allow him. And as soon as, 5'6", 2 years from then, when he's in 8th grade and everybody's 5'6", and now post players are 6'2", and everybody else dribbles the ball better, shoots the ball better, et cetera, and now his career is done. And so it might have fit his personality at that age, but it wasn't the approach that was going to enable him to stay in the game the longest. And it wasn't the long-term approach that was going to help to develop his skills and the global skill set for a long period of time. And then finally, we get to kind of elite athletes. This is going to be towards the end of adolescence. And so these are athletes who are going to have the mentality and also the physical attributes and the skill set to move on to, what we would call kind of elite performance, which, within the States is probably college basketball and beyond. So more or less, if you're, especially if you're a Division I athlete, you're basically in the top 1 to 2% of players, within the country. So to me, that's elite. So that's kind of where I distinguish between the different mindsets. And again, especially with the recreational, the developmental, and the competitive, there's no hard line on, well, once you get to 13 years old, now you've gone from developmental to competitive, or once you're, 16 years old, you need to be elite instead of competitive. There's no hard line in terms of the age range. It's more based on the individual's personality, the individual's mental skills, preparation, etc. And these kind of classifications have little to do with the player's actual skill, except for the elite designation. So I might be exceptionally good for my age group at 10 years old, but I may still approach sports like a recreational athlete. I could be, the best player on my team, the best player in my area, the best player in my city, but have a recreational mindset that I'm going out there and I'm playing for the activity, I'm playing for fun, and, I remember being at a training a couple high school players while there's a little league baseball game going on, and player hits a couple home runs and is the bigger, stronger, better player on his little league baseball team. And as soon as the game ends, he doesn't care about that. He runs up and it had rained the day before and there's a little bit of a hill. And so there's a little bit of mud on the hill. And he was the first one running over and playing in the mud. This is not a kid who's overly obsessed with winning and overly obsessed with competition. This is a kid who's just out there having fun, and as soon as the baseball game ended, his fun ended. And so now he's looking for the next thing to do. Our best player, one of my clubs in Europe, our best player, he would skateboard everywhere. If he wasn't on the basketball court, I had to go and find him at the skate park, and so, he would come, he worked hard, he did his thing, he had fun, then he left. And he was the best player at his age group, but he was always getting into different things because he was motivated more by fun as opposed to, anything else, development or competitive at that age. And there's nothing wrong with that, in likelihood, that's going to prolong his career because he's developing the motivation and he's moving and progressing his own feelings as opposed to being pushed by a parent or pushed by a coach to do something that he might not be psychologically ready for or mature enough psychologically to handle. So I think a lot of players in the States end up burning out because they get pushed too early into an overly competitive environment, and they're not psychologically mature enough to handle that environment. They may have the physical skills, they may have the biological maturity, so I might be a 6'2" 8th grade girl. I have the biological maturity, to be a varsity player, to be a college player. But I might have, the emotional maturity of, a 12-year-old, and that's not wrong. And it happens all the time. Somebody grows quicker than another player. And because we see somebody who's bigger, we assume that they're kind of more mature in all aspects of their life. On my team this year, even with 18, 19-year-olds, my least mature player was my biggest, strongest player. It's just developmental growth, and how you grow physically is not necessarily going to be supported or coincide with your emotional or mental growth, and so a lot of mistakes that I think we make are assuming that somebody's, what we see in terms of their, biological growth, their maturity, their emotional growth is the same. And
Right.
So we end up with people getting pushed too far too quickly.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Coach. Coach, I have a few more questions here.
Yeah.
A bit of a two-parter here from Coach Joni De La Cruz. I think he's talking specifically about 12 and under age range. So I assume this would be something around 9, 10 years old to 12 years old. And
Okay.
he would like to know, how do you select the right drill for this age range, and what percentage of time should we spend on skill development versus physical development?
Okay. One, I don't know that there's a right drill. Certainly not a general right drill. There's probably a right drill for a specific group in a specific situation. But that's going to depend on a number of factors, not the least of which is how much practice time do you have, how long is your season, how experienced are your players, what kind of competitions are you preparing for? All these kind of questions need to be asked when you're determining how exactly you want to practice. And so to me, the correct drill for a team is going to be one that, especially at that age group, you're going to want them to have success, but not make it too easy. So I think one thing that coaches often forget is we know that we can progress a drill. So if we start it easy, we know we can make the drill harder. But we can also regress a drill. So if we start a drill and it's too hard, we can always take a step back, make it easier. And so, I like to challenge players, but I want them, especially at that age, I want them to have some success, and not constantly fail at whatever it is that we're doing. As for skill development, to me, every part of practice is skill development. And that's even at the college level. I mean, I would say that we spend, I don't know, maybe less than 10% of our time is kind of what, strategy focus, what we're going to do in our next game, because this team does this. Everything else that we do, to me, is, skill development, whether that's, how do you play against a trap? To me, that's a skill, and then because we practice generally, how do you play against a trap? Then when we play against a team who traps, we don't have to do a ton of specific work to prepare for them because we have these general skills. How do you use a screen? How do you guard a screen? These are general skills that need to be developed. And so then when we play a team that sets a certain type of screen, we don't have to do a ton of specific work for their exact offense because we know how to guard a screen. We know different ways that we're going to guard a screen. We know how we're going to use a screen. So when we play teams that switch versus going under versus chasing, we've learned how to do these various skills already during practice so that when we face a specific defense, have to change everything. We've already learned how to do these skills. And then, at that age group at 9 and 10 years old, you might not need all these skills. And that's one of the other parts of the long-term athlete development program for me, is that if you have continuity within your program, you don't have to teach every skill at that age group. So, and I think that's one of the advantages within either a club system, especially as you see with Europe, but even with an AAU club system here, when it's done correctly, is if I'm, when I coached under nines, I knew the skills that we were practicing. The 10-year-old coach could see what we were practicing and know what those players should know. So that under 10 coach doesn't have to start right from the beginning. He can pick up where I left off. And then the under 11 coach can pick off where the 10s. So for instance, for us, we really emphasized dribbling, competing, and layups. Those were our three big things. And then guarding one-on-one. Okay, we never talked about help defense. We talked about guarding the ball. We talked about handling the ball. And we talked about layups. Most, under nines, the game's played in transition. We didn't run a half-court offense. We didn't really worry about any things like that. We really worried on, can we guard the ball? Can we dribble the ball, especially under pressure? And can we make layups? And then we try to make things as competitive as possible. So those were the things that we emphasized. So now under 10s can come in and say, all right, well, all the players can dribble the ball. All the players have a basic idea how to guard the ball. Pretty good at making layups. Okay, now what are we going to focus on? Okay, well, now at 10s, we need to start to work on shooting. Okay, and we need to put in the first step of help defense. And now then the 11-year-old coach can come in and go, okay, well, now they've got a good basic. I'm going to build on that. Now we're going to work on helping the helper, in our defense. We're going to really expand and focus on team defense. And we're going to now start to put in setting screens to get people open, a little bit more half court, half court offensive execution, you know. So because you're growing up within the same club, you can do those things. You know, what happens in the States oftentimes is, you know, I play for this team and, you know, at 9 years old, and then I go to this team over here at 10 years old, and the 10-year-old coach does coach was, and the players on the 10-year-old team, we had 3 or 4 different coaches. So, you know, my team ran pick and rolls all the time at 9 years old. Another player, he didn't run any offense at 9 years old. You know, and another team, you know, he ran a flex offense. You know, so we all have a different background, and so now the new coach has to start over, and whatever he's going to do and teach that, because likely, you know, half the team or more has no idea what he's talking about. And so when you have continuity of development, you can teach the game in stages. You don't have to teach every single skill. And so, like I said, if you start out early and you pick 1 or 2 or 3 things that you're going to emphasize, doesn't mean that we never took jump shots with my team. It's just not something that we spent a ton of time on, not something that we emphasize. And so then the next age group, they can emphasize those things a little bit more. And so you can build the player over a period of years, because you know that you have that continuity within your club. Whereas when teams or players are jumping from team to team, club to club, there's no continuity. I mean, you even see it now. This is one of the things that people complain about with the NBA, free agency, you know, college programs after 1 year. You know, I mean, I even saw one of my friends was tweeting about it yesterday, the advantage possibly, you know, of high school players going straight from high school to the G League and skipping college, is now they could have a longer period of continuity in their development, so they can play with the same high school or AAU program for 4 years, and then they can jump and play in a G League program for 2 to 3 years before they make the jump to the NBA. And now there's a little bit more continuity and within their development, as opposed to going from playing high school to going to college for a year, to going to an NBA team, to then being sent back to a G League team, where you lose a lot of that continuity. You know, and so at the elite level, it's one thing, but when you're losing that continuity at a younger age, where players really don't have a lot of experience and you know, have a huge disparity in skills. I mean, you get to the G League or you get to the NBA, you know, as much as we think of, you know, somebody like Giannis or James Harden being dramatically different than whoever you want to put as the 400th best player in the NBA, the truth is those players are pretty homogeneous compared to an average 10-year-old team. You know, where at 10 years old, you could have, you know, height range of players that's, you know, huge. You can have a skill range from somebody who's never played basketball before to somebody who has several years of experience and maybe has some older brothers, you know, and is a pretty competent basketball player already, all on the same team. And so when there's that lack of continuity from year to year, the disparities between players get bigger and bigger, and it becomes harder for that coach to decide what's that right drill for this group, because I have one player who's never played before and I have one player you know, who's pretty skilled. How do I manage the situation? You know, and so the tendency in that environment is you coach to the middle. And so then the player who's, you know, the outlier on the top end tends not to get challenged. And the player who's the outlier on the bottom end tends to get left behind because they don't really understand your middle group, which is normal. But like I said, it doesn't help either the outliers. And we have to be creative with our instruction. We have to be creative with our drills and how we shape a practice. And maybe, you know, like I've done with situations like that, you know, my better player, I'm going to give them specific individual challenges so that they're, you know, getting something else out of practice, as opposed to just going through the same thing that the middle group's going through. And then the player, the beginner player, maybe we need to pull them out of practice and give them a lot of individual attention, you know, maybe with an assistant coach to try to catch them up quicker to what the group is doing. You know, or maybe an assistant coach is basically their position coach, you know, or their personal coach in the middle of practice. So the team coach is kind of watching everything, and then the assistant coach is watching this one player and helping this one player to try to catch them up quicker. So I don't know if that answers the question about, you know, kind of coming up with specific drills.
Right. But I think it's an all-encompassing answer because, like what you're saying, there has to be more specific. We have to have more specific data as to how we can come up with a recommendation on how to answer that question. But I think you also answered the other question, my follow-up question, which would be from one of the attendees as well. It's how you would promote positive energy, or I guess in this case, engaged among the players through both positive and negative situations. I guess you kind of answered that with making sure that you don't just coach through the middle because of the outliers and the players that are not as skilled. Get some work with the assistant coaches, and that's what the coordination between the head coach and the staff is really integral. One of the things that you mentioned, Coach, earlier was burning out of players at such a young age. Coach Marshall Defensor asked, what are the indicators that youth athletes aged 13 to 16 are starting to get burned out from the sport, basketball in particular?
I mean, I think the easy one is, what do they do before and after practice? Do players show up early? Do they stay after? When practice ends, are they still shooting? Or when practice ends, do they run off the court? Now, some of that obviously, depends on, the environment. I've coached in situations where, dad is standing at the door looking at his clock, and as soon as, we huddle together for the end of practice, dad's running to the car and the kids running to the car because they got to get, take care of the brother and the sister and so on and so forth. So obviously there's different environments, but, I know the players who I've coached who truly love to play, as soon as practice ends, if there's nobody coming in right after us, I have to kick them out of the gym. They're still in there, shooting around, playing, and it's not serious, it's fun. And that's because they haven't burned out. They enjoy it. The players who are there because I'm not sure whether they love basketball or not, but they need a scholarship to pay for their college education. As soon as practice ends, they're on their phone. They're quick to leave the gym. They do what they're supposed to. When it's mandatory to be there, they're there, but they don't do a whole lot else. And so I think that's the first indication that you see is, I think another thing is the language that they use. Do your players say, I have to go to practice? And it's common. It's a scheduled time. It's a mandatory thing. So, that is kind of the verb that we would use. But once we start to look at going to practice as something other than fun, I think we're starting to move in that direction. And so to me, those are the two indicators. I think also you can see things like, what's their body language during practice? Do they change the way that they receive feedback? So if you had a player who at the beginning of the year was really positive, seemed really engaged, and now towards the end of the season, maybe he's less engaged or, slumping, putting, shoulders and head down, things like that. It may not be burnout, but it may be. Maybe the environment was too competitive for this player and they're less interested now and they're just trying to get through the season as opposed to really enjoying the experience. There's also, more physical burnout. So things, depending on the age, you may see things like a lack of conditioning coming in, which is actually from overtraining as opposed to, a true lack of conditioning. Things like losing weight can be an indication of a physical burnout. So there's different things, again, depending on the ages, depending on the players that you're working with. But I think one of the big things to look at is there a major change somewhere? And is that change, whether that's body language, whether that's behaviors pre and post practice, whether that's behaviors in terms of receiving feedback, in terms of interactions with teammates, or a big difference in terms of, whether it's conditioning or stature, weight, things like that, can all be indicators, and all those individually could be explained by something else. But that's when you start to see one of those, and definitely if you see two of those, that's somebody that you want to keep an eye on, or maybe you want to do a little bit more investigating. And that's one of the important things with having personal relationships with your players, and not just looking at them as players, but as people, because what's going on in the rest of their lives is going to affect their performance on a court. So there's this wasn't part of the crossover book, but people refer to it as the biopsychosocial model of athlete development. And so if, maybe, one player, maybe you see, a real change in their behaviors, but maybe it's because their parents are getting divorced. You don't know anything about that player, and you only see them coming in, and you only see them as a player, and now they're playing poorly and stuff. And maybe you don't realize that it has nothing to do with basketball. It has nothing to do with your coaching. It has everything to do with where they're coming from in their personal lives before they get to practice. And same thing, it can be, any number of things. If a player, fails a test right before they come to practice, they're going to be in a different mood for practice than if they got an A on that test, or if they didn't have tests. One thing to be cognizant of, especially as you get to older age groups, here, one of the things I try to do is really back off during finals week and midterms week, because statistically, there are more injuries and more illnesses during times of extreme stress, and finals, midterms. Academic stress is going to contribute to overall stress, weaken immune systems, and tend to, especially at the college level, you're going to tend to have players who are sleeping less. Less sleep is going to tend to lead to a higher risk for injury. So if you're aware of, these things that are going on in your players' lives, you may see a drastic change in behavior, but it might be because it's midterms, not because the player is burned out. But again, those are the kind of things that I would tend to look for. And the more that you know the player and know, kind of the social environment that they're within, that they're coming from, then you have a better sense of whether that's a chance that it is burnout, or if there's something else going on in their lives that's really going to explain that change in behavior.
Thank you, Coach.
Hi, we have a question from our YouTube watchers on YouTube from Zyrex.
Okay.
What are the pros and cons of AAU basketball? Should countries adopt it, or adopt the European way, which is a basketball academy?
Well, I would say, to a certain extent, most European clubs are quote unquote like AAU clubs, and the fact that they're not run within a school. That's the difference for the States, is you have AAU, which is run outside of the school system and it's its own organization, and then you have school sports. And so traditionally, most sports were run within schools. Nowadays, most elementary schools, middle schools don't sponsor school sports. So at least up until high school, your only avenue for sports participation is through either a public rec center or an AAU team. Or now there's more private facilities being built so that you can join a team through there, but they're generally going to play AAU. Or another one of the smaller organizations that's more or less the same as AAU. When I've coached in Europe, there really isn't school sports. Everything is run through, your neighborhood club. And then how that functions kind of depends on how big your neighborhood or city is. Like cities I've been in, we only had one club because we were really small towns. If you live in a big city, obviously you're gonna have more choices of where to play. So in terms of whether you should adopt AAU, I know I read an interview with Ettore Messina years ago, and he said the biggest advantage that the U.S. had was the school system. Reason being, within the States, at least the school system traditionally is free. It really isn't anymore. You kind of have to pay for certain things because school districts are cutting budgets. But for the most part, it's free to play a school sport. Whereas to join an AAU team, there might be an expense. To play it at a local rec center, there's an expense. And so I think the thing to copy isn't AAU or school or whatever. But again, it's how can you create an environment where you can get the most possible players involved in that sport. And so from that standpoint, copying AAU because AAU is a business, and as a business, the goal is, to shepherd our resources into as few people as possible, and move on. And so, most AAU programs have maybe one team per age group. And there's different AAU organizations. It's impossible to say that AAU is one thing. There's some very good, well-run clubs, and then there are AAU teams that are basically just one team, that a guy started, based around one player. But to me, my goal would be at the youngest age groups, I would want as many players as possible in my organization. Whether I'm at a school, whether I'm at a club, whether I'm at a rec center, I want as many players participating as possible with my organization. And I want to develop as many players. I want to create opportunities and keep as many of those players involved for as long as possible. And then, as players get older, some will naturally figure out that they're not very good at basketball, and so they're going to quit. They're going to decide they don't like basketball. They're going to quit. They're going to get picked off by quote unquote better and more competitive clubs. So you're going to lose some of them. But the goal to me is, up until, again, at least 12, if not 14 years old, to me, the goal is I want to get as many players as possible into my organization, regardless of where my organization, whether it's my town club, whether it's my AAU team, whether it's my school. And I want to keep as many of those players moving forward and involved as possible. And that may mean stratifying the players. I may find that at 10 years old and I have 40 players in my organization, but I have 10 who are starting to get competitive, and I have 10 who are definitely still recreational, and then I have 20 in the middle. Well, maybe I need to stratify. Maybe I need to create a more recreational environment where, these players only come once a week. And then for the more competitive players, maybe I need to add a practice for them, so they're getting more attention, they're getting more work. And is that going to create a greater disparity between those two in terms of skill levels? Definitely. But I'm trying to keep them involved. And as opposed to cutting the 10 who are definitely recreational players, I'm giving them an experience that meets their needs. And so now maybe they stay involved and they enjoy it. And now one of them goes through a huge growth spurt. Now they become more interested. And because they stayed involved, they can re-enter and become a more competitive player. Whereas if they had been cut from the team because, everybody else was getting a little bit more competitive and they were still kind of just doing it for fun, so they didn't fit. And so I cut them, so now they didn't have any kind of physical development. And then they hit this growth spurt, and now they're just this awkward teenager. Well, instead, they had fun. They kept playing. They developed some skills. They're a little bit behind, but now with their height, they can make up for their being a little bit behind on their skills. And we can, now that they've kind of matured and stuff, and they want to take it seriously, now that we can transition them, into the more competitive team. So again, I wouldn't say that AAU, I think to answer the question directly, the good of AAU is there's a potential that it gives opportunities to players who may or may not have other opportunities. So if I get cut from my high school team, I can still go and play AAU basketball. There's nothing prohibiting me from playing on an AAU team. So to me, that's good. I think there's a potential that through AAU you can play against better competition, which I think is good. Especially at the late adolescent ages. The bad of AAU, I think, is we think we're identifying talent at early ages, and so we're cutting players too soon. I think there is some unethical behavior. I think that happens in schools as well, but I think it gravitates to AAU because there's less control. And basically anybody can start their own AAU team, whereas within a school system, you have to get hired by a school district, which generally means that you have to go through at least an athletic director and a school board to get hired, as opposed to, just starting my own team. So there's a little bit more control over who coaches in a school system, which is good and bad. It may be exclusionary to somebody who could be a great coach, but doesn't fit some profile that an athletic director has. So again, there's good and bad for both sides. But I think the biggest is you can't look at AAU as one thing, because there's such a disparity between clubs, and especially between age groups. What happens at under 10s versus what happens at the elite high school age, there's a ton of variation. And so, to me, I prefer the club system that I was involved in Europe, where, players generally progressed through the same club, and there was continuity of development. But I do think that there's drawbacks to that as well, because I think there's a tendency for players to develop kind of a personality, within their peer group. And so if I play with the same team from 10 to 12 to 14 to 16, I'm always going to look at Johnny as the best player. And so I might not fully express my skills because when we were 10, Johnny was the best player. And so I'm always deferring to Johnny. But maybe I'm progressing, and maybe if I really was exposed to a different situation, maybe I would be the best player, and so that, again, I think is the advantage of, in the States, where you have a school team and an AAU team. And if you're pigeonholed into a certain role in your school team, well, you can go to an AAU team where now you play a different role. So maybe you're forced to be a 6'3" post player with your high school team, but you move to your AAU team and now you're a 6'3" wing or 6'3" guard. That's an advantage of that system. So I think any environment's going to have its pros and cons. But I think at the end, it doesn't matter, what you call it. The goal should be, again, we want to give as many opportunities to as many players as possible. And then we want to try to push each player at the appropriate level for their both biological and psychological maturity. And then we want to give different opportunities so that, we don't get pigeonholed into roles and only one player progresses. But we give those opportunities to different players, so that, they can experience different positions, different roles on teams, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of that you can get from, in a club system in Europe. I can push a 14-year-old. I can have that 14-year-old play with his under 14 team, but I can also push him up to the under 16 team, the under 18 team. So maybe on the under 14 team, he's the star, gets all the shots, goes to the under 16 team. He's a role player now in the under 18 up all the time. And because he's had all these experiences, he's going to have a more complete development than somebody who only played with his peer group, all the way up, on the same team. So for instance, I had a 17-year-old point guard on my men's team. He also played. We didn't have an under 18 team with our club, so he played with a different club under 18s with an agreement with our club. So he got to play in the men's league, be our point guard, get beaten up, and then he got to also go play as a shooting guard on an under 18, on a really good under 18 team. So we got those different experiences. And so I think that has an advantage that you can sometimes get within the U.S. system because you have the school system plus the AAU system, but you're not guaranteed to get that kind of environment, and you're not going to have that same kind of continuity that you tend to have in a European club system.
All right. Question for Coach? Oh,
Sorry. Dr. McCormick, I have a question. time in Europe and in the US with many teams across many different age platforms. Could you kindly give us 5 qualities that a basketball coach should possess in order to be successful? Thank you.
5. One, I would say empathy, because I think you need to be able to relate and understand your players regardless of age and differences. But I think if you can really understand where they're coming from, their backgrounds, it's going to make you a better coach and enable you to create a better environment. Curiosity, the best people in any profession, I think, are the ones that are going to be lifelong learners and continue to seek out new information to make themselves better. So I think if you're a curious person, you're going to tend to be a better coach because you're not going to. I think what a lot of coaches do is they find one approach that worked one time, and then they continue that approach. And then if somebody doesn't fit into their approach, they see that as other person's mistake because I was successful doing it already and you don't fit into what I do, so then you're wrong. And so I think, somebody who's more curious is going to look at, well, how can I change and adapt to this individual, or what can I learn from this individual that can make me a better coach? I think the ability to teach is very important. And I think understanding what teaching is, or maybe more importantly, understanding what learning is, because I think we have an idea that's developed in us from an early age, that the teacher is the person who stands at the front of the classroom and talks the whole time. And the students are the people who sit quietly at their desks and absorb the teacher's words. And that makes us smart. And I don't think that's what coaching is. I don't think that's what teaching is. So I think part of coaching is really understand what teaching is. How do you help a player to learn? How do you create that environment where that player is going to learn whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do? And so I think if you really understand that learning is something that the individual has to do, not something that you're doing to the individual, that changes your approach in terms of how you're going to design a drill and how you're going to get feedback and when you're going to get feedback and how you're going to instruct. And so I think really being an expert instructor, expert teacher is another quality. I think confidence is important. I think a lot of coaching mistakes come from insecurity. Coaches tend not to like to be challenged, and we tend to view our players almost like subordinates. I think confidence can embrace, players challenging them, players asking questions, and I think that is a positive for the players. I know I'm pretty confident, and because I'm confident that I know what I'm doing, I am willing to ask questions of players. I'm willing for players to talk back to me because it doesn't affect my self-belief if they question me. Whereas I think a younger coach or a more insecure coach becomes combative to that because that's a challenge to their authority, that's a challenge to their self-belief. And then they question themselves. I want players to question. I want players to have their opinions. As long as it's done respectfully, obviously. There's a difference between having an attitude problem and asking a question. So I think having confidence will help that. Let's see.
Last one,
Fourth
Coach.
one. Yeah, I know. I had it on the tip of my tongue and then I forgot. I would say I don't know. I think those 4 kind of capture You know, I mean, to me, if you're curious, you know, you're going to seek out more information, which is going to help you. I guess maybe the last one would be kind of along the same lines, but being creative. 'Cause I think creative coaches, you know, can find ways to solve problems. If you're a person who naturally thinks creatively, you're going to look at situations differently. And so where, oh, no, I thought what I was going to say. And so if you can look at a problem differently, that gives you an advantage. If everybody else is, you know, looking at things in the same way and you look at something differently, I think that gives you an advantage, whether that's from a competitive standpoint or whether that's from reaching maybe you have a, you know, like when I got to Europe one year, the coach before me warned me about one player. He's like, she's going to be a problem for you. She's a problem for everybody. You know, her little sister's on the team. She's protective of her little sister. Her little sister isn't as good. She's going to cause problems, blah, blah, blah. You know, and rather than accept that, you know, I kind of looked at that as a challenge, and you know, I changed her position. I changed her role. I changed her relationship with her sister to an extent on the court, you know. And so I think, you know, in a way I looked at it a little bit creatively instead of accepting the information that was given to me. And she ended up being our best player. You know, she was an all-star that season. And I would guess that was the best season of her career. If we had won maybe 2 more games, she probably would have been the MVP of the season. So, you know, things like that. The one that so I'll give you a 6th now, is, for lack of better words, being positive. So I think there's an old article that I reference a lot in my writing that it talks about Coach K versus Coach Knight. I don't know if that's the best example, but basically the way that you view people is going to be the way that you treat them. So if I view my players positively, if I think my team comes to practice with a desire to improve, with a desire to play hard, I'm going to look at any mistakes that they make in a more positive light. Well, maybe they're trying something that they're not good enough yet, or maybe I didn't explain myself well enough, and that's why they made the mistake. If I view people negatively, I think people are just trying to get by with the least amount of effort, or, you know, I think people are just trying to get over on me and not do what they're supposed to. As soon as I see a mistake, I'm going to blame the player, and I'm probably going to make that player run. Oh, you didn't make that shot. You didn't get that loose ball. You're just not playing hard enough. Get on the line. Let's run. And so I think the way that you view, and for lack of a better term, you know, a positive approach to your coaching and viewing your players from a positive perspective, I think it changes the environment and brings the best out of the players.
Thanks, Coach.
Thank you, Coach. Coach, unfortunately, we are out of time. I still have a few questions. I'll send them over to you, and I'll get back to the coaches who ask those questions. Before we close, I'd like to thank you, Coach Brian McCormick. And before we let you go, where can the coaches find you on the internet, and what can we expect from you in the near future?
Probably best to find me on Twitter, at Brian McCormick on Twitter. I've got a website, 180 Shooter is probably the easiest website. The number is 180shooter.com. Yeah, those are the easiest. You know, my email is coachmccormick@hotmail.com. So if you look up how to spell my last name, it's just coach and then my last name at hotmail.com. What to expect from me. I'm currently looking for a new coaching job. So if anybody's hiring, let me know. And willing to travel. I'm working, hopefully we're trying to get a TV show made, and I'm hopefully finishing up another book in the next well, let's say month or two. It was supposed to be done by now, but such is the life of a writer. And then I'm speaking on Monday at the Texas Association of Basketball Coaches. I don't know how to access that. I don't know if it's open or if it's only open for the Texas Basketball Association coaches. Anyway, I'm talking at that on Monday at, I think, 11 a.m. Eastern time, or maybe it's Central time. I forget. But Doug Brotherton is the guy who's organizing that, at least as far as I'm concerned. You can find him on Twitter, I'm sure. So, yeah, that's what I got going on.
All right. Thank you very much, Coach. And we really appreciate your time. Hopefully we can do another webinar because soon, because Coach Ariel and all of the coaches, he has a book that I haven't really read yet, but it's called Fake Fundamentals. And there are a lot of very, for me at least, controversial takes that I don't necessarily agree with. That's why I would love to talk to you about that again soon. So for all of
let me know.
Definitely.
Thank you, Coach. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good luck out there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Coach. For all of the coaches that are still here, we have Coach Sam Newman of the G League next at 10 p.m. Please make sure to sign up for it if you haven't already. Unless there's anything else from Coach Ariel, Coach Teddy, and Coach Brian. That's it for me, and I'll hand it over to you, Coach Ariel.
I'm good. And I'd like to thank Coach here for your time. And of course, stay safe and God bless, Coach.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. See you again for our last session for tonight. Thank you.